Susan, would you like to read this love poem? This love poem. This is George Herbert. So first of all, welcome to everyone. This is a poem by George Herbert called Love, and it introduces us to the mystery of the Eucharist that we celebrate today at the beginning of the Easter Triduum.
Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. But quick-eyed love, observing me grow slack from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. A guest, I answered, worthy to be here. Love said, you shall be he. I, the unkind, ungrateful, oh my dear, I cannot look on thee. Love took my hand, and smiling did reply, who made the eyes but I? Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. Let my shame go where it doth deserve. But know you not, says love, who bore the blame? My dear, then I will serve. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. So I did sit and eat.
Thank you. So I thought we could reflect today upon the Eucharist and share some reflections with each other about what it means to us. Because the Eucharist, although it is the great sacrament, the great sign of union with Christ and of our unity and friendship with each other, it has carried or taken on a lot of baggage over the years as well. It's become a source of division and conflict and confusion for people. And this poem by Herbert very simply but very deeply suggests how something as simple as love, can create such complex resistance and feelings in us. The poem begins with love bidding him welcome. But my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin. So there's something in us all, some guilt, some shame, some feeling of unworthiness, and sometimes our religious training has worked on that and made that excessive, so that we end up in a kind of self-rejection, which this poem is about in a way. It's about the conflict between being welcomed, being accepted, being embraced, being invited, and our pushing that back, our resisting it. Guilty of dust and sin. Dust because we feel, dirty, or we feel earthy, or we feel too gross to accept this great gift. And sin, just the accumulation of all the mistakes we've made. But quick-eyed love, so love is very quick and observant. Observing me grow slack, observing that I was pulling back just as I was about to go in, just as I was about to accept the invitation, the welcome, I grew slack. And love, however, drew nearer to me. So as I drew back, love actually comes closer to me, sweetly questioning. So it's not accusing us, it's not putting us down, it's not making us feel ridiculous, but sweetly, gently, kindly, lovingly asking. And it's asking, not judging. And what does it ask? It says, do you want something? Is there something missing? You know, are you lacking anything? And love, I mean, the poet, that's us, replies, kind of a guest worthy to be here. So what I lack is the worthiness to be at the meal that you are inviting me to join. I'm just not as good as the other guests. I'm not dressed well enough, or I don't have as good a line of conversation as the others, or I'm not as interesting a person as the others are. So I'm just not worthy, really, to be there. I don't have the worthiness to be a good guest. And love says, you do. You shall be this guest. So it just, love continues to confront this force of resistance or self-rejection that is part of the dark side of the human psyche. And we reply, the poet replies, you really think I'm this guest that you really want? If you only knew what I was like. I, the unkind, so I'm not even a nice person, if you really knew me. The ungrateful, so I know what you're offering me, but I don't even feel gratitude for it, because my self-rejection is stronger than the gift you're offering and the gratitude I should naturally feel. The word Eucharist, and this is a very Eucharistic poem, of course. The word Eucharist in Greek means thankfulness or thanksgiving. We give thanks. And giving thanks could be just formal, you as children you were told to write a note of thanks to the mother of the child whose birthday party you went to or something. We sort of give thanks in that formal way. But to live with a thankful heart is a very different thing. To feel the thankfulness of our being. I think as soon as we get out of doing and thinking and we touch this experience of contemplation that we've been talking about, as soon as we just realize that we do have this capacity to be, and silence and solitude allow us to discover that, then thankfulness follows automatically. You don't have to be formal about it. You don't have to try to be thankful. You are. It's as soon as we awaken to the gift of our being, we're thankful. So the poet here is saying, I'm not even capable of thankfulness, of gratitude. And I can't even look on you. I can't even be with you. I can't even look at you. I'm just so isolated, so cut off, so lost in my dust and sin. I can't look at you. So again, another attempt to sort of push back. Leave me alone. And love took my hand. So again, love moves towards us, not giving up. Love took my hand. So now there's actually, some more, it's not just words, it's actually contact. And to take someone's hand, what does that mean? You take their hand to lead them. You take their hand to show companionship, friendship, like President Trump with Mrs. May. Or because you're frightened of walking down steps. So you take someone's hand. It's an intimacy. You're breaking or you're crossing a kind of a barrier if you do that. Love took my hand and smiling. So a smile says a lot, more than words can. And smiling said, well, you say you can't even look at me, but who gave you the capacity to see? I am the source of your vision. You couldn't see me if it weren't for me. But the poet is absolutely resistant. This is taking years and years of therapy to get through this. And so this is 5 lines, but this is 25 years of therapy, 2 hours a day. Truth, Lord, yes, but you did make my eyes, you did give me this gift of being, but I have spoiled them. Truth, Lord, but I have marred them. And look at all the things I've done with my eyes and all the ways I failed. So just let my shame go where it deserves. So just, stop running after me. Stop calling me. Stop holding my hand. Stop trying to convince me that I am really loved by you. So just let me go in my shame, in my self-rejection, off to wherever I deserve. And do you not know, says love, and know you not, says love, who bore the blame? So here's a big twist in the argument, and it's exposing the dynamic of redemption and of forgiveness. Because love here is not denying that there is blame. Love is not saying, oh, you're really perfect. He's saying, yes, of course you have made mistakes, of course you are sinful, of course you are dust, and you are affected or disabled by your shame. But who bore the blame? Who carried that? Who carries that burden that you're carrying? You're not in fact carrying it on your own. Somebody else has lifted it off you, if you could see that. So then it's as if the poet says he can't really argue any more with that. So the person is saying, I'm not worthy, and love is saying, well, you may not be worthy, but I'm making you worthy. Lord, I am not worthy to receive you under my roof, but only say the word and my soul shall be healed. So he's not arguing about whether you are worthy or not, or whether you've made mistakes or not, but he's saying it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because that's been taken care of. You've actually paid off that debt, so you can start living again. So then we say, or the poet says, my dear, well, thank you, my dear, then I will serve. Okay, I'll come to the meal, because now we begin to see that it's an invitation to a meal. So I'll come, but I'm not really still worthy to sit at the table like a proper guest. I'll serve. I'll stay in the kitchen, and I'll just bring the food out. I'll do the washing up afterwards. So that's I'll come, but that's how I'll come. And then the final response of love is quite strong, insistent. Now there's a commandment. The person's resistance, our resistance, has been worn down by this dialogue, which has taken 25 or 30 years. The resistance has been worn down, and all that's left is the final, the final coup de grace, and the command. So now love says, "You must sit down," says love. So you're not going to be there running around serving and still half locked into your sin and self-rejection. You must sit down, says love, and taste my meat. Meat is also just means food. So you're actually going to sit, and you will enjoy this food, whether you like it or not. You are going to do this. And then the final line is this sort of surrender, really. He just says, "So I did sit and eat." So it's a beautiful poem, and Simone Weil came across this poem at a critical moment one Easter that she was spending at Salem Monastery in France before the war, and somebody gave her this poem, and Simone Weil was quite a conflicted person psychologically, great soul and a great intellect, but quite a difficult psyche, and so she was enraptured by this poem, she said, because it summarized everything that she was going through in that stage in her journey of faith. And so she learnt the poem off by heart, she said, and repeated it to herself many times. And you don't get a poem unless you learn it by heart and have made it part of you. So it's a simple poem, but it has a great drama to it. Of course, this dialogue and this conflict between love and the ego. Love calling the ego to simply let go, to surrender, to accept the gift, the unconditional gift. So I think it's a beautiful poem to reflect on Holy Thursday. At the liturgy this evening, we'll be celebrating the first Eucharist that Jesus incorporated into or transformed the traditional Jewish meal. If you've ever been to a Passover meal or even a Friday night Sabbath meal with a Jewish family, you'll realize that it really is a meal. There's a ritual to it, but it is about a family coming together and they'll light 2 candles. I had a Jewish friend once who came to a mass in the community, and she said it was so like what we do at home. The 2 candles, the bread and the wine, and the blessing. Blessed are you, Lord God of all creation. Exactly the same words as they will use in a Jewish ritual meal like that. So it's important, I think, for us to remember, although we have elevated the Eucharist, of course, into a great mystical sacrament, and but in doing so, we often have distanced it from us. And for a long time, people went to Mass, but they didn't feel worthy to go to communion. And because you might do that once a year. That was the rule, that you had to go once a year. But the rest of the time, devout Catholics anyway, would often feel that they were not in a state of grace. They'd done something wrong. And if they hadn't been to confession the night before, Saturday night, then they weren't worthy to go to communion. So this, somehow or other, this invitation of the Eucharist to come despite the fact we're unworthy was lost. And the Eucharist became a reward for being good. And you had to be healthy in order to go to hospital. And it would be like going to a hospital and say, oh no, you're far too sick to come in here. So somehow we really lost it. And you can't lose it completely, because it does have its own reality, its own mystery, and its own life, the Eucharist. But we certainly tried as far as we could to ring it around with too much formalism, too many rules and regulations, too much fear. Even now, if you're giving out communion and you drop the host, and it touches the ground, so traditional Catholics always going to feel like, God, this is, there's going to be an earthquake now, or God's going to strike you dead, or even when I was a boy, I remember at First Communion, you were told not to chew on the bread. So that's why you had this very thin little host, which you then dissolved, thankfully, and then if sometimes it didn't dissolve, it would get stuck at the top of your palate. And so the amazing thing is that through all of that, overwriting and over-regulation, and somehow or other, the spirit of the sacrament, the spirit of that invitation somehow got through. Maybe it didn't get through to everyone, and a lot of people did stop going to church and just felt that the whole thing was really too much and too complicated and too bound up with guilt and formalism and so on. But I think in recent times, certainly in the Catholic tradition, there's been a big change in that. And putting it into English, the new translation is pretty awful. And the new translation was an attempt to go back. Somebody once said to me, quite a high up person, said, I was complaining to them about this new translation, English translation of the Mass, and he said, well, we wanted to avoid the language of the barbecue. So, he felt that the previous translation into English was too familiar. How do you say it was barbecue language, but anyway, that was what they felt. So, but I think there's no real going back to that hope, to that time where the Eucharist was not seen primarily as an invitation to a healing experience, but was seen as something you had to be worthy of, and you were not really worthy of, and something that needed to be distant and formal. So there's a balance in this, but it's the balance that we find very naturally, I think. I was having dinner with some cousins of mine in Dublin the other day, and the children had all come home from school, some of them from work or college, and the meal was being prepared and got onto the table, and the table was laid. There was a ritual there. It was a form. It was formal in that sense, that they did this every night. But what was important was that the form allowed them to gather. You know, they weren't just in their rooms and coming down and taking some food and taking it back to their room. There was a gathering and time to talk about the day, or to speak with the guests that were there, and so on. So it was a meal, but it was a sacrament as well. It was something very holy, in fact, and holy and domestic at the same time. Something that's been lost in a lot of modern culture, where families don't have time anymore to sit and eat together, and to do so in that relaxed but formal way. So I think we are perhaps recovering this understanding of the Eucharist. Of course, it's different in the way we do it in the church. If you have, more people than you have sitting around a dining room table, and you have a church and you have ecclesiastical architecture and the trappings of the religious environment, it's different, but it's different from sitting in a small group of people celebrating, listening to the readings, talking about the readings, taking some time to be quiet, not looking at your watch, not doing the 20-minute mass that gets the obligation done and out of the way. So taking the time and then meditating after communion. Well, that's a very different experience. That's much closer to the Last Supper and to a family meal, or to a meal, to a religious ceremony, which is also a meal celebrated with friends. So we celebrate the Mass in different ways, in different situations, but the essence of it is the same, I think. And its relationship to meditation is very important for us, because it's when we recover the contemplative dimension of our faith, when we listen to Jesus' teachings on prayer and we realize that he is teaching us to pray in a contemplative way, and that this is not secondary but primary, that to be a follower of Jesus is to put this contemplative teaching alongside the teaching of to love our neighbor, to come to the aid of those who need us, that this is central to our identity as and to our relationship to Jesus in faith. So as soon as this contemplative awareness of our faith begins to awaken, and it awakens, I think, through meditation. As earlier this morning, we had a little ceremony in my house in our meditation room. We were receiving Paul as an oblate novice of our community, and we were also receiving 2 Belgian meditators online as postulants. They were beginning their journey as oblates of the world community. And one of them said how meditation some years ago had actually given her a belief in God. She was coming, from that distance. She didn't even believe in God or know what God meant or so. So that it was meditation that awakened that basic experience and basic faith knowledge for her. And the rest then followed from that, clearly, and then she came to Christ. So the contemplative experience is essential, I think, for our understanding the Eucharist and to celebrating it in the appropriate way. When we celebrate it tonight in the church on the island, we'll respect the environment and the people who are there, and it's different from celebrating it with a few people around a small table. But the reason that this contemplative awareness awakens us to the real meaning of the Eucharist is, I think, that it's the same experience of presence. So when Jesus says, take this bread, it is my body, and eat, take this wine and drink, it is my blood. This is very strong language and quite controversial language in its day. Shocking language. We don't go around, we're not cannibals. But what is the purpose of putting it so strongly and almost offensively? It's what is he saying? It's saying, this is my presence. And real presence, it doesn't mean some abstract, dogmatic, doctrinal abstraction. Real presence, real presence means you're really present. You're there. Present to the people you're with. Whether they are fully present to you or not, you are present to them. And you remain present to them to the degree to their capacity, according to their capacity to see that. But you don't withdraw and become absent because they don't fully understand that you are present to them. And you may be absent to them for these reasons that George Herbert describes in the poem, because you don't feel worthy, because you're isolated, because you're locked into yourself, or because you're still trapped in the traumas of your past. So there may be very understandable and forgivable reasons for you not being there in the same way that Christ is there for us. But that doesn't mean, as the poem shows, that he withdraws. So take as long as you like. And you don't have to feel guilty about feeling guilty. And eventually, if you stay open to it, if you want to stay open, eventually, your resistance begins to break down. And you can become present to the one who is present to you. And that's what real presence means. It has to be, eventually, it has to be reciprocal. We're present to each other. And that's difficult for us because we get distracted. My cousin has a rule at the table every night that the children are not allowed to bring their mobile phones, because otherwise they would be only half present. They'd all be looking at their, if they weren't the center of the conversation at that moment, they would feel, well, what am I doing here? Then they'd take out their phone. So being present means that you have to endure the fact that you're not always going to be the center of attention, but you are still present. You're still there. It's one of the reasons that when novices start living in monastic community or religious community, they will often say the most difficult part of the life is the recreation time together in the evening. It's just hanging out together, having coffee or something after the evening meal, for example. They'll often say that's really awkward and just don't feel comfortable with that because it seems too formal. Also, I think sometimes because they're not performing, they're not the center of attention, and they're not used to it. They haven't had those kind of evening family meals over the years, which make us comfortable with being with a group and not necessarily being the center of attention the whole time, but enjoying the presence that we are and have for each other. That's what real presence means, I think. So the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist can't be different, essentially. It's a different form, different expression, but the real presence must be the same presence as the presence we find in meditation. And if it wasn't, it would be very strange. And if it is the same presence, then we've discovered something very wonderful. We've actually broken through into the meaning of Christian faith and what the words of Jesus mean and what Easter means and what resurrection means. We've got it. The presence in my heart, even when I'm distracted and not present and sending text messages in my head during the meditation, but that real presence that I know and feel to be within me is the same presence that I can share in and express and celebrate with other people when we go to church or when we sit around the table and have Mass together in that way. So there's a lot more we could say about the Eucharist, but I think it comes down to this experience of being present, and unless we can be present to ourselves, and that's those times of solitude, those times of silence that we saw Jesus going into regularly throughout his life, the same times of silence and solitude we practice in meditation on a daily basis. Unless we have that experience of being present to ourselves in the present moment, it's going to be very difficult for us to understand what that invitation means. Love bade me welcome. It's the presence of love that is welcoming us and urging us and pulling us simply to become closer and closer to it until we interiorize it, until we eat it. And that's the symbolism of the communion, to go to Mass without sharing in that communion, without physically ingesting it, is incomplete. And the Eucharist is seen as the completion of Christian initiation, which is true. But there's a danger that always a danger that we ring it around too much. And we need to be a little less hung up about that, I think. And if you think of the Last Supper, who was there? Well, Judas was there for one. And we don't see Jesus saying, here is communion, here is my body and blood, but not for you. You know? He knew he was going to be betrayed. Was Judas in a state of grace? Well, apparently not. But was he excluded from the table or the communion? No. In the same way, when you have a family meal, like the other night, it's the family meal, but the family meal can welcome other people, can welcome a guest. And that blesses and enriches the guest. May make, So anyway, I'm not saying that we don't need a certain formality and certain guidelines, but I think we most of all need to see the Eucharist as a way of presence. And unless we are present to ourselves, and that's the contemplative experience, it will be difficult for us to understand fully what a gift the Eucharist is and why it is in itself a thanksgiving. It awakens this spirit of thankfulness within us. And it's not thankfulness in the sense that you've been rewarded for something. Oh, thank you so much for giving me this diploma or giving me this check. But it's the thankfulness of being. Thank you. I am thankful for the basic gift of being. Not of having anything, but just of being. That's what thankfulness means. And that's what we get, I think, in this experience of presence. And there was a little short description of the Eucharist from the very early church, probably from about 150 AD, from Justin Martyr. And it just describes how they saw and celebrated the Eucharist in the very early church, and we'll recognize some of the essential elements, but what we see here are the simplicity of it. On the day we call the Day of the Sun, Sunday, all who dwell in the city or country gather in the same place. The Memoirs of the Apostles and the writings of the prophets are read as much as time permits. When the reader has finished, he who presides over those gathered admonishes and challenges them to imitate these beautiful things. Then we all rise together and offer prayers for ourselves and for all others, wherever they may be, so that we may be found righteous by our life and actions and faithful to the commandments, so as to obtain eternal salvation. When the prayers are concluded, we exchange the kiss. And the kiss of peace in the early church was a kiss on the lips, because you were sort of exchanging breath. So it was very physical. You still see it, in, sometimes I know Russian leaders or not Chinese, I think, but anyway, Russian leaders sometimes still do that kiss on the lips. Then became a little more problematical and fears of hygiene, I suppose. And then there was a little cross or an object which was called, which you kissed, and then you handed it on to the next person and they kissed it. So then, a few 100,000 years later, it became like a rather chaste hug, and then shaking, and then nothing for a few 100 years, and then shaking hands, and then or doing this in the East, or just nodding to the people around you, depending how far how far south you are, how Latino you are. So anyway, when the prayers are concluded, we exchange the kiss. Then someone brings bread and a cup of water and wine mixed together to him who presides over the assembly. He takes them and offers praise and glory to the Father of the universe through the name of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. And for a considerable time, he gives thanks that we have been judged worthy of these gifts. So the prayers would have been much more spontaneous than our concept of reading from the missal and getting the words right. When he has concluded the prayers and thanksgiving, all present give voice to an acclamation by saying, Amen. When he who presides has given thanks and the people have responded, those whom we call deacons give to those present the Eucharisted bread, wine and water, and take them to those who are absent, to the sick. So, very familiar, but something very relaxed, and something sacred, but also very relaxed and domestic in a way about this early Eucharist. Okay.